The morning started like any other Tuesday across the globe. Office workers sipped their coffee, students rushed to catch buses, and families prepared for another ordinary day. Then the sky changed at exactly 9:47 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Massive. Shadows fell across every major city on Earth. People stopped walking and looked up. Above them, floating impossibly in the air, were ships unlike anything humanity had ever imagined. They weren't the flying saucers from old movies or the sleek designs from science fiction shows. These vessels looked like living crystals, transparent, and glowing with soft blue light stretching for miles across the sky. In New York, a taxi driver pulled over and stepped out of his car, staring upward with his mouth open. In Tokyo, a businessman dropped his briefcase on the sidewalk. In London, a mother pulled her children close as they gazed at the magnificent and terrifying sight above them. Then came the voice. It didn't come from speakers or radios. The voice simply appeared in everyone's mind, speaking in perfect English, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, and every other language on Earth simultaneously. The tone was calm, almost musical, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "People of Earth," the voice said, "we are the Hegemony Fleet. We come in peace to offer your species integration into our galactic community. Do not fear us, we mean you no harm." Within hours, every government on the planet was in emergency session. The President of the United States canceled all meetings and rushed to the Pentagon. The Prime Minister of Britain held an urgent cabinet meeting. World leaders who hadn't spoken in years were suddenly on phone calls that lasted deep into the night. The aliens, who called themselves the Collective, requested a meeting with Earth's leaders. They suggested the United Nations building in New York, but their ship was too large to land there. Instead, they created something that defied all known physics. A beam of soft light descended from their ship, and when it touched the ground, it formed a perfect circle of what looked like solid light. The aliens simply walked down this beam of energy as if it were a staircase. The first alien to step onto Earth was tall and graceful, almost 7 feet in height. Its skin seemed to be made of the same crystal material as their ships, translucent and glowing faintly from within. It had long, elegant limbs and a face that was almost human, but somehow more refined, as if someone had taken human features and made them perfectly symmetrical. When it moved, it seemed to float rather than walk. This being introduced itself as Commander Zarath, the leader of this particular fleet. Through some kind of translation technology, every word it spoke was perfectly understood by everyone present, regardless of their native language. "Your world is beautiful," Zarath said, looking around at the hastily assembled crowd of world leaders, military officials, and scientists. "We have observed many planets in our travels across the galaxy, and yours has a unique charm. Your species shows great potential." The Secretary General of the United Nations, trying to maintain some diplomatic composure despite the unprecedented situation, asked the question everyone was thinking, "What do you want from us?" Zarath smiled, or at least made an expression that seemed like a smile. "Nothing that you are not willing to give. We simply wish to bring your planet into our great community of worlds. You will benefit greatly from our technology, our knowledge, our protection." "Protection from what?" asked the Defense Secretary. "From yourselves, primarily," Zarath replied. "Your species is still quite young, still quite aggressive. You fight among yourselves over resources that could easily be shared. You damage your beautiful planet with primitive energy systems. You create weapons designed to destroy rather than protect. We can help you move beyond these childish phases of development." The world leaders exchanged nervous glances. This didn't sound like the peaceful first contact they had hoped for. "And if we refuse?" asked the president. Zarath's expression remained pleasant, but something cold flickered in its crystalline eyes. "We hope that will not be necessary. But let us first show you why cooperation would be dies." Without any visible signal, the massive ship above them began to change. Parts of it became transparent, revealing complex machinery inside that pulsed with energy. Suddenly, every nuclear weapon on Earth simply stopped working. In missile silos across America, Russia, China, and every other nuclear power technicians watched in horror as their most powerful weapons went completely dead. The nuclear submarines beneath the oceans found their reactors safely shut down. Even the nuclear power plants that provided electricity to millions of people powered down, gently, without any dangerous radiation or explosions. "We have neutralized your most dangerous toys," Zareth explained calmly. "Do not worry. Your power plants will restart once our business is concluded. We simply wanted to demonstrate that your weapons cannot harm us." The military leaders in the room looked at each other with growing alarm. If the aliens could disable their nuclear arsenal so easily, what else could they do? "Perhaps you would like to see what your most advanced weapons can accomplish against our technology," Zareth suggested. "We are happy to demonstrate." 3 days later, the most powerful military leaders on Earth gathered at a secure testing facility in the Nevada desert. They brought everything they had: the newest laser weapons that could cut through steel in seconds, railguns that could fire projectiles at incredible speeds, plasma cannons that burned hotter than the surface of the sun, and electromagnetic pulse weapons designed to destroy any electronic device. Zaret H arrived with 2 other aliens and stood calmly in the middle of the testing range. The 3 beings simply stood there, making no visible preparations for defense. "Please," Zareth said, "show us what your species considers powerful." The first test was a laser that had cost billions of dollars to develop. It fired a beam of concentrated light that could melt tank armor in 3 seconds. The beam struck Zareth directly in the chest, and something amazing happened. The laser beam simply bent around the alien as if hitting an invisible mirror and reflected harmlessly. Into the sky. Next came the railgun, firing a projectile at speeds that would have punched through any known armor. The projectile simply stopped in midair 3 feet from Zareth, hung there for a moment, then gently fell to the ground. The plasma cannon, the electromagnetic pulse, the sonic disruptors, the experimental quantum weapons, nothing worked. Every human weapon, no matter how advanced or powerful, was easily deflected or absorbed by some kind of invisible shield around the aliens, but the worst part wasn't that the weapons failed. The worst part was how the aliens reacted. They laughed, not cruel laughter, but the kind of gentle, amused laughter that adults might make when watching small children play with toy swords. It was the laughter of beings who found humanity's greatest achievements cute and harmless. "Oh, how wonderful!" Zareth exclaimed, clapping its hands together. "You still use kinetic projectiles and directed energy, just like the Bellari did, and the Zephyrians and the Cortani. Every young species goes through this phase." One of the other aliens spoke up, its voice filled with what sounded like genuine affection. "They're still throwing rocks and making loud noises to frighten their enemies. It's actually quite endearing." "Your weapons are very impressive for your level of development," Zareth continued. "But you must understand, these are the tools of a species that is still in its technological infancy. Chemical explosions, metal projectiles, concentrated light beams, these are the weapons of children playing at war." The human military leaders stood in stunned silence as the aliens continued their gentle mockery. "We will return in exactly 1 month, Zareth announced. "This will give you time to discuss our offer of integration with your people. When we return, we hope you will be ready to join the galactic community peacefully. If not..." The aliens' voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. As the aliens walked back up their beam of light to their ship, one of them called back cheerfully, "Don't worry. Every species feels embarrassed about their primitive weapons phase. You'll look back on this and laugh someday." The ship disappeared into the sky, leaving Earth's most powerful people standing in the desert, feeling smaller than they had ever felt before. The day after the aliens left, the world changed in ways no one could have predicted. Countries that had been enemies for decades suddenly found themselves working together. The President of the United States called the leaders of Russia and China within hours. Old grudges were forgotten. Trade wars stopped. Border disputes became meaningless. For the first time in human history, Every nation on Earth had the same enemy and the same goal, survival. Within 48 hours, the Emergency Human Coalition was formed. It wasn't pretty and it wasn't perfect, but it was fast. Military bases around the world were converted into research facilities overnight. Scientists who had spent their careers working on civilian projects suddenly found themselves designing weapons. University professors became military advisors. Even retired engineers and physicists were called back to service. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been enjoying her retirement in a small town in Colorado, spending her days gardening and reading mystery novels. She had spent 30 years working on theoretical physics, published dozens of papers that only a few hundred people in the world could understand, and was looking forward to a quiet life. Then the phone rang. "Dr. Vasquez," the voice on the other end said, "this is General Patterson from the Pentagon. We need you." 2 days later, she was standing in the largest underground research facility she had ever seen, surrounded by the brightest minds from every country on Earth. The facility had been built in just 96 hours, carved out of solid rock, beneath a mountain in Switzerland. Thousands of workers had labored around the clock to create a space where humanity's last hope could work in secret. The first meeting was chaos. Scientists argued in a dozen different languages. Engineers drew the diagrams on whiteboards that others immediately erased and replaced with their own ideas. Computer programmers typed furiously, trying to simulate weapons that existed only in theory. "We need something they haven't seen before," Dr. Vasquez told the assembled group. "They've conquered other planets, other species. They expect us to follow the same pattern of technological development that everyone else has followed." A young physicist from Japan raised his hand. "What if we try quantum entanglement weapons? We could theoretically create a weapon that exists in multiple places at once." "Temporal displacement," suggested a woman from Germany. "We could send the energy backwards in time so it hits them before we fire." "Dark matter manipulation," called out someone from Brazil. "If we can harness dark matter, we could create weapons that exist outside normal space." The ideas came fast and desperate. Everyone knew they had only 1 month, and everyone knew that humanity's survival depended on them. Creating something impossible. But while the world's greatest scientists worked on exotic weapons in underground bunkers, something else was happening in a small military museum in Virginia. Tom Chun had been the curator of the National Military History Museum for 15 years. He was a quiet man who loved old stories and ancient weapons. While most people his age were interested in the latest technology, Tom found beauty in the craftsmanship of medieval swords and the engineering of Civil War cannons. On the 3rd day after the alien demonstration, Tom was watching the news coverage for the 100th time. He had recorded every second of the aliens deflecting humanity's most advanced weapons, and he watched it over and over, looking for something everyone else had missed. That's when he noticed it. The aliens had tested their defenses against lasers, railguns, plasma weapons, and electromagnetic pulses. They had demonstrated that their shields could handle anything that fired energy or high-speed projectiles. But there was something they hadn't tested against. Tom walked through his museum, looking at displays that suddenly seemed more important than they had in years. Here was a crossbow from the 1400s, still functional after 6 centuries. There was a flintlock rifle from the Revolutionary War, restored to working condition. In another case sat a Japanese katana, its blade still sharp enough to cut paper. These weren't just museum pieces anymore. They were weapons that the aliens had never encountered. Tom picked up his phone and called the Pentagon. It took him 2 hours to convince anyone to listen to him, and another 4 hours to get transferred to someone with authority. Finally, he found himself talking to General Patterson himself. "General," Tom said, trying to keep his voice calm, "I think I know why the aliens were so confident about our weapons. Mr. Chun, we have the world's best scientists working on this problem. I don't think museum pieces are going to help us." "That's exactly my point," Tom said. "They tested their shields against our most advanced weapons, but they didn't test them against our oldest ones. They dismissed them without even trying." There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. You're talking about swords and bows and arrows, the general said slowly. I'm talking about weapons that are so old, so simple, that an advanced alien civilization might not even consider them worth defending against, Tom replied. Think about it. If you were designing a shield to protect against the weapons of a spacefaring civilization, would you bother programming it to stop a wooden arrow? The general was quiet for a long moment. That's actually not crazy, he admitted. Their shields seem designed to analyze and counter advanced threats. But what if they can't process something they consider primitive? Within hours, Tom found himself on a military transport plane flying to the secret research facility in Switzerland. While Dr. Vasquez and her team worked on exotic quantum weapons, Tom was given his own small team and a different mission: gather every functional, antique weapon they could find. It wasn't easy. Most museums kept their weapons in non-functional condition for safety reasons. But there were collectors, historians, and enthusiasts around the world who maintained working versions of ancient weapons. There were blacksmiths who still knew how to make medieval swords. There were craftsmen who could build working crossbows. Using techniques that hadn't changed in centuries, Tom's team worked quietly, while the rest of the world focused on high-tech solutions. They found a man in Scotland who still made longbows the traditional way, using wood that had been seasoned for decades. They located a woman in Mongolia who crafted arrows using techniques passed down through generations of her family. In Japan, they discovered a swordsmith whose family had been making katanas for over 400 years. The most interesting discovery came from a group of historical reenactors in England. These people spent their weekends dressed as medieval knights, practicing with real weapons and armor. They knew how to use crossbows, swords, maces, and catapults not as museum pieces but as actual tools of war. People think medieval weapons were crude, explained William, the leader of the reenactment group, as he demonstrated a crossbow that could punch through modern body armor. But these weapons were perfected over centuries of actual combat. They're simple, but they're devastatingly effective. Meanwhile, Dr. Vasquez's team was making progress on their exotic weapons, but every breakthrough seemed to create new problems. The quantum entanglement weapon worked in theory, but required more power than a nuclear reactor could provide. The temporal displacement cannon could send energy backwards in time, but they couldn't control where or when it would appear. The dark matter manipulator could theoretically create devastating effects. But dark matter was incredibly difficult to capture and contain. As the days passed, two very different preparations were taking place. In the main research facility, thousands of scientists worked on revolutionary new weapons that pushed the boundaries of physics itself. In a smaller section of the same facility, Tom's team quietly assembled an arsenal that would have been familiar to warriors from 1,000 years ago. Most people paid no attention to Tom's work. The media focused on the exotic research happening in the main laboratories. World leaders visited Dr. Vasquez's team and marveled at their theoretical breakthroughs. But no one seemed interested in a small team that was collecting bows, arrows, swords, and catapults. With 2 weeks left before the aliens returned, both teams were ready to test their weapons. Dr. Vasquez had managed to create working prototypes of several exotic weapons, though they were still experimental and unpredictable. Tom had assembled the largest collection of functional antique weapons that had been gathered in modern times. Neither team knew which approach would work, but both knew that humanity's survival might depend on thinking differently about what made a weapon truly dangerous. Exactly 1 month after their first visit, the aliens returned. But this time, they didn't come alone. The single crystal ship that had amazed the world 4 weeks ago was now just one of hundreds. The sky above Earth darkened as an entire fleet materialized, stretching from horizon to horizon. Each ship was larger than the last, and the biggest ones were so massive they created their own weather patterns. Clouds formed around their edges, and the temperature dropped several degrees in every major city as they blocked out the sun. People everywhere stopped what they were doing and looked up in terror. The message was clear: humanity's month of preparation time was over, and the aliens were no longer interested in being patient or polite. Commander Zareth's voice filled everyone's mind again, but this time the musical tone was gone. The voice was cold, businesslike, final. "People of Earth," it announced, "your time for consideration has ended. We require your answer now. Will you join our galactic community peacefully, or must we proceed with integration protocols?" World leaders had been expecting this moment, but seeing the massive fleet still sent chills down their spines. The President of the United States, speaking for the entire Emergency Human Coalition, responded through every communication channel on Earth. We need more time to consider your offer," he said, hoping to buy a few more days for the secret weapons projects to be completed. Zareth's laugh echoed across the planet, but there was no warmth in it this time. "Time?" the alien commander said. "You have had sufficient time. Your species always asks for more time when faced with inevitable change. We have seen this pattern on countless worlds. The answer is always the same." The largest alien ship, a crystal cathedral that stretched for miles across the sky, began to descend toward Earth. As it came closer, people could see that it wasn't just a ship, it was an entire city, with structures and lights visible through its transparent walls. "Since you seem unable to make a decision," Zareth continued, "we will demonstrate what resistance means. We have selected one of your military installations for a practical example of our capabilities. Your leaders will witness this demonstration, so they can make an informed choice about their species' future." The target was Fort Morrison, a remote military outpost in the mountains of Colorado. The base housed only about 200 soldiers and was used primarily for training exercises. But it was also equipped with humanity's most advanced defensive systems, the kind of technology that the Emergency Human Coalition had been secretly developing and upgrading over the past month. World leaders were transported to the alien flagship in beams of light, just as Zareth had descended to Earth 4 weeks earlier. They found themselves standing on an observation deck that offered a perfect view of the military base below. The deck was made of the same crystal material as the ship, completely transparent, making it feel like they were floating in empty air thousands of feet above the ground. "Please observe," Zareth said, gesturing toward the base below. "Your soldiers have been given the opportunity to surrender. They have chosen to resist. This will serve as an educational experience for all parties involved." The president looked down at Fort Morrison and felt his heart sink. The base looked so small from this height, so vulnerable. He could see the soldiers moving around like tiny ants, preparing their defenses, completely unaware that they were about to face weapons beyond their imagination. "This is unnecessary," the Secretary General of the United Nations said. "Those soldiers are just following orders. They don't deserve to die for our political decisions." Zareth turned toward him with what might have been surprise on its crystalline features. "Die?" it said. "Who mentioned anything about dying? Your species really is quite primitive in its thinking. Death is such a crude solution to conflict. We prefer more elegant methods." With a gesture from Zareth, the alien attack began. The first weapons to fire from the fleet weren't like anything humanity had ever seen. Beams of soft blue light descended from several ships, but instead of exploding or burning, they seemed to make solid objects simply fade away. The outer walls of the base's buildings became transparent, then disappeared entirely, leaving the interior structures floating in mid-air. "Molecular phase displacement," Zareth explained casually. "We can shift matter into a parallel dimensional space. The walls still exist, technically, but not in a way that provides any practical barrier." The soldiers at Fort Morrison responded immediately, firing their most advanced weapons at the alien ships. Laser cannons that had cost millions to develop sent beams of concentrated light toward the fleet. Railguns fired projectiles at incredible speeds. Plasma weapons created balls of superheated gas that burned brighter than welding flames. Nothing worked. Every shot was absorbed or deflected by shields that the human observers couldn't even see, but the aliens weren't finished with their demonstration. The next weapon was even more terrifying. A different type of beam descended from another ship, and wherever it touched, gravity seemed to go insane. Vehicles were compressed into balls of twisted metal the size of basketballs. An entire building folded in on itself until it became a cube no larger than a refrigerator. The soldiers inside simply walked out, completely unharmed, but their equipment and weapons had been rendered completely useless. Gravitational compression, Zareth noted. Very useful for neutralizing material threats without harming biological organisms. Your soldiers are perfectly safe, but their tools of resistance have been eliminated. The demonstration continued for 20 minutes. The aliens showed weapon after weapon, each one more impossible than the last. They had devices that could freeze time in small areas, leaving soldiers standing like statues while their weapons simply stopped working. They had beams that could make electronics forget how to function, causing computers and communication systems to shut down permanently. They even had something that seemed to make the very air thick as soup, slowing down any projectile to a crawl before it gently fell to the ground. Through it all, the soldiers at Fort Morrison kept trying to fight back. They used every weapon in their arsenal, every defensive system, every trick they had learned in decades of military service. And nothing, absolutely nothing, had any effect on the alien ships, but what made the whole thing even more humiliating was how the aliens reacted to humanity's resistance. They were genuinely entertained. Zareth and the other alien commanders watched the battle like adults watching children play war games in a backyard. They pointed out particularly clever tactics to each other and made approving sounds when the human soldiers showed creativity or bravery. "Oh, look at that one," alien said, indicating a soldier who had jury-rigged 2 different weapons together. "How resourceful. They're learning to combine their primitive technologies." "The pattern is always the same," another alien observed. "First they try their most powerful weapons, then they attempt creative combinations, then they resort to desperate measures. This species is following the script perfectly. Rather amusing that they still believe kinetic solutions can solve energy problems," Zareth added. "Though I admit, their persistence is admirable. Most species give up much sooner in the demonstration phase." The president watched the destruction below and felt completely helpless. Humanity's best soldiers, using their most advanced weapons, were being treated like entertainment by beings who could barely be bothered to pay attention to the fight. Finally, after Fort Morrison had been completely neutralized, every weapon destroyed, every defensive system disabled, every piece of military equipment reduced to useless scrap, Zareth turned back to the assembled world leaders. "This concludes our demonstration," the alien commander announced. "As you can see, resistance is not merely futile, it is somewhat embarrassing. Your soldiers fought bravely, but bravery cannot overcome the fundamental limitations of primitive technology." The alien gestured toward the ruined base below, where soldiers were sitting around looking stunned but unharmed. "We have given you a gift today," Zareth continued. "We could have simply conquered your world immediately upon our arrival. Instead, we have shown you exactly what conquest would entail, without permanent harm to your people. This is more consideration than we have shown most species." The president looked around at the other world leaders and saw the same defeat in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. "You have 6 of your planetary rotations to prepare your surrender ceremonies," Zareth announced. "We suggest you use this time wisely. Gather your people, explain the situation to them, and help them understand that joining our community is not only inevitable, but beneficial." As the world leaders were transported back to Earth in beams of light, Zia, or called after them with what sounded almost like genuine kindness. "Do not feel ashamed of your defeat," the alien commander said. "Every species goes through this moment of realization. Someday, when your people have evolved beyond their current limitations, you will help us guide other primitive worlds through the same process. It is simply the natural order of progress in the galaxy." The crystal ships remained in the sky, a constant reminder that humanity had 6 days left before their civilization ended forever. Tomchin's arrow flew through the air at barely 200 feet per second, slower than a car on a highway, pathetically slow compared to the energy weapons that had just failed. It was made of simple materials, a wooden shaft, steel tip, and feathers, for guidance. Any military expert would have laughed at the idea of using such a primitive weapon against technology that could bend space and time. The arrow struck the hull of Commander Zareth's flagship and did something impossible. It went right through. For a moment, everyone, human and alien alike, simply stared in disbelief. The crystal hull that had deflected quantum bombs and temporal energy beams now had a simple wooden arrow sticking out of it. Like a dart in a board. Inside the alien ship, alarms began sounding for the first time since the invasion began. What? Zareth's voice echoed across the planet, but for the first time, the alien commander sounded confused instead of confident. How is this possible? Our shields detected no energy signature, no exotic matter, no advanced technology. The projectile was classified as debris. Tom didn't waste time celebrating. He grabbed another arrow and fired again. This one struck a different part of the ship, punching through the alien hull like it was made of paper. Around the world, his volunteers began firing their own ancient weapons. In London, William's crossbow bolt pierced the shield of an alien scout ship and embedded itself in what looked like a control panel. In Tokyo, a museum curator fired a reproduction of a samurai arrow that had been crafted using 800-year-old techniques. It passed right through an alien ship's energy barrier and struck something important. The ship immediately began spinning. Out of control, the aliens' response was immediate and panicked. Ships that had been floating serenely above Earth cities suddenly began moving erratically, trying to understand how primitive weapons were penetrating their advanced defenses. Impossible. Zareth's voice had lost all its musical quality and now sounded harsh and desperate. Our defensive systems are designed to counter all known weapons technologies. These primitive kinetic projectiles should be irrelevant. But that was exactly the problem. The alien shields were too advanced, too sophisticated, too intelligent. They had been programmed to identify and counter every possible threat that an advanced civilization might create. Energy weapons, exotic matter projectiles, gravitational distortions, temporal anomalies. The shields could handle all of these because they recognized them as weapons, but a wooden arrow flying at subsonic speed? The alien computers looked at it and saw nothing more threatening than a falling tree branch. Their threat assessment systems classified it as environmental debris and didn't even bother to activate the shields. The arrows were literally too primitive for the aliens to defend against. Dr. Vasquez, watching from the underground facility, suddenly understood what was happening. They've over-engineered their defenses, she said into her radio. Their shields are like a sophisticated computer virus scanner that can detect every known type of malware, but can't stop someone from physically unplugging the computer. The realization spread quickly through the human resistance. Around the world, people began grabbing anything that could be considered a pre-industrial weapon. Museum displays were raided. Historical reenactment groups emptied their collections. Even people who had never held a bow in their lives started improvising with whatever they could find. In New York, a retired history professor fired an antique musket at an alien ship. The lead ball, traveling at a fraction of the speed of modern bullets, punched through the alien shields and cracked their crystal hull. In Brazil, indigenous hunters who still used traditional bows found that their arrows were devastatingly effective against alien technology. In Scotland, a group of Highland Games enthusiasts discovered that throwing ancient hammers could damage alien ships that had survived nuclear weapons, but the most effective warriors turned out to be the people who had spent years perfecting these ancient skills. Medieval combat enthusiasts, historical martial artists, traditional archers, and museum weapon experts suddenly found themselves on the front lines of humanity's most important battle. The aliens tried desperately to adapt. Their ships began deploying kinetic barriers designed to stop physical projectiles, but these barriers were calibrated for high-velocity modern weapons. A crossbow bolt moving at 400 feet per second simply pushed through the barriers like they were made of tissue paper. "Recalibrate all defensive systems," Zareth commanded. "Treat all kinetic projectiles as potential threats, regardless of velocity or technological sophistication." But it was too late. The aliens had made a critical error in their invasion planning. They had studied humanity's advanced weapons, analyzed their technology, and prepared for every possible form of sophisticated resistance. But they had completely ignored 10,000 years of human military history that came before gunpowder and electronics. More importantly, humans were fighting with weapons they understood completely. A bow and arrow had no computer systems to be hacked, no electronics to be disrupted, no exotic energy signatures to be detected. They were simple machines that converted human muscle power into kinetic energy, and they had been perfected through centuries of constant warfare. William, the medieval weapons expert, found himself leading an impromptu assault on an alien landing craft in London. Armed with a reproduction of a 15th century crossbow, he moved through the city streets with a group of volunteers who carried everything from longbows to throwing spears. "Aim for what looks like windows or sensors," he shouted to his team. "These ships are built like medieval castles. Find the weak points and exploit them." The group's arrows and bolts began finding their marks. Each hit caused visible damage to the alien ships, systems sparking and failing as primitive weapons, disrupted advanced technology in ways the aliens had never anticipated. In orbit above Earth, Commander Zareth stood on the bridge of the flagship, staring at a wooden arrow that was still embedded in the wall behind the command console. The arrow had missed the alien commander by inches, and for the first time in centuries of conquest, Zareth felt something that had been forgotten: fear. "This is unprecedented," one of the other alien commanders reported. "Our analysis indicates that 97% of their current weapons are classified as pre-industrial technology. Our shields are unable to process threat assessments for weapons this primitive." "How many casualties?" Zareth demanded. 17 ships have suffered critical damage. 5 have been forced to make emergency landings. The humans are targeting our sensor arrays and communication systems with remarkable accuracy. Zareth looked around at the bridge crew, seeing confusion and panic in faces that had never experienced defeat. "Our entire invasion doctrine is based on countering advanced civilizations," another commander observed. "We have protocols for quantum weapons, temporal manipulation, even multidimensional attacks. But our systems literally cannot comprehend the threat matrix of a pointed stick propelled by twisted plant fiber." On Earth, the tide of battle was turning. What had started as humanity's desperate last stand was becoming something else entirely: a rout. The aliens' technological superiority meant nothing when their defenses couldn't recognize the threats they were facing. Tom Chun, firing his 20th arrow of the battle, watched as another alien ship began smoking and listing to one. Sighed. "You know what the funniest part is?" he said to his team as they reloaded their ancient weapons. "These weapons worked just fine for thousands of years before we invented all our fancy technology. Maybe we shouldn't have been so quick to put them in museums." Above them, Commander Zareth's voice filled the air one final time, but now it carried none of its former authority. This is impossible," the alien commander said, its voice breaking with something that might have been despair. "Our analysis indicated that your species had moved beyond primitive warfare. This violates all known patterns of technological evolution. How can beings capable of quantum manipulation still resort to ... to pointed sticks?" The answer, of course, was simple. Humans had never really stopped being human. Beneath all their advanced technology, they were still the same species that had survived ice ages with nothing but sharp rocks and clever thinking. They had reached for the stars, but they had never forgotten how to fight with their hands. As alien ships began retreating from Earth's atmosphere, many of them trailing smoke from arrow holes in their hulls, Tongchen smiled and reached for another arrow. Sometimes, he thought, the old ways really were the best ways. 6 days, that's all humanity had left. The world felt different after the demonstration at Fort Morrison. People walked through the streets looking up at the alien ships with a mixture of fear and resignation. Some cities held protests, with crowds demanding that their governments fight to the end. Other places saw people preparing for what they believed was the end of human independence. Religious leaders held prayer vigils, Scientists made desperate last-minute attempts to create miracle weapons. But most people simply went about their daily lives, not knowing what else to do. In the secret underground facility in Switzerland, Dr. Vasquez hadn't slept in 3 days. Her team had finally managed to create working versions of their exotic weapons, but every test brought new problems. The quantum entanglement bombs worked, but they were unpredictable. Sometimes they created massive explosions, sometimes they simply fizzled out. And once they had accidentally created a small black hole that took 6 hours to dissipate safely. "We're running out of time," she told her exhausted team. "These weapons are our best hope, but they're still experimental. We don't know if they'll work when we need them most." The temporal displacement cannon had shown promise in tests, successfully sending energy backwards in time by several seconds. But controlling where and when that energy appeared was nearly impossible. In one test, they had tried to send a laser blast back 5 seconds, only to have it appear 3 days earlier in a janitor's closet. Burning a hole through a mop bucket, the dark matter manipulation device was perhaps the most powerful weapon they had created. In controlled conditions, it could create gravitational distortions that would theoretically tear apart any material, no matter how advanced. But dark matter was incredibly difficult to work with, and the device consumed enormous amounts of energy. They had enough power for maybe 3 shots before their generators would overload. "It's not enough," Dr. Vasquez admitted to General Patterson during their final planning meeting. "Even if all our weapons work perfectly, we have maybe a dozen shots. They have hundreds of ships." Meanwhile, in a smaller section of the facility, Tom Chun was having his own doubts. His collection of ancient weapons seemed almost ridiculous compared to the alien technology they had witnessed. How could a wooden bow compete with energy beams that could phase shift matter? How could a steel sword stand against weapons that could compress buildings into cubes? But Tom had spent the last 6 days studying every second of footage from the alien demonstrations, and he had noticed something that no one else seemed to see. The alien shields didn't just deflect advanced weapons, they analyzed them first. He could see brief flashes of light lasting only milliseconds as the shields scanned each incoming projectile or energy beam. The shields were learning about each weapon before deciding how to counter it. "What if?" Tom said to his small team. "Their shields can't analyze something they don't recognize as a weapon?" William, the medieval weapons expert from England, looked up from the crossbow he was adjusting. "You mean something so primitive that their computers don't even classify it as a threat?" "Exactly," Tom replied. "Their shields are designed to counter advanced civilizations. They probably have detailed information about every type of energy weapon, every kind of projectile, every form of technology that a spacefaring species might develop. But would they even bother programming defenses against a wooden arrow moving at 200 feet per second? The idea seemed crazy, but it was the only hope they had left. On the final day, as alien ships positioned themselves directly over every major city on Earth, both teams prepared for humanity's last stand. Dr. Vasquez's exotic weapons were loaded onto mobile platforms and moved to strategic locations around the world. Tom's ancient weapons were distributed to volunteers, historians, reenactment enthusiasts, museum curators, and anyone else who knew how to use them properly. The president addressed the world one final time. "My fellow humans," he said, speaking from the White House while alien ships cast shadows over Washington, D.C. "Today we face the greatest challenge in our species' history. We may not have the advanced technology of our visitors, but we have something they don't understand: the determination to remain free. Whatever happens today, remember that we chose to fight rather than surrender our independence." The attack began at noon, coordinated across every time zone on Earth. Dr. Vasquez's team fired first. The quantum entanglement bombs launched from hidden positions around the globe, their exotic energy signatures invisible to conventional sensors. For a brief moment, hope flickered as the bombs struck several alien ships. Strange explosions of twisted spacetime created visible distortions around the crystal vessels, and for the first time, the aliens seemed surprised. "Direct hits on targets 7, 12, and 15, reported the weapons coordinator. We're seeing shield fluctuations and minor hull damage." But the celebration was short-lived. Within minutes, the alien shields began adapting. The same quantum signatures that had initially penetrated their defenses were now being easily deflected. The alien technology was learning, analyzing, and countering each new weapon as fast as humanity could deploy it. The temporal displacement cannons fired next, sending bursts of energy backwards through time to strike the ships before the weapons were even fired. For a few seconds, this seemed to work. Several alien vessels showed damage that appeared out of nowhere, their pilots confused by attacks that seemed to come from empty space, but again, the aliens adapted quickly. Their shields began extending backwards through time, creating temporal barriers that prevented the displaced energy from reaching its targets, the dark matter. Manipulators were humanity's final hope. These weapons created gravitational anomalies so powerful that they should have been able to crush any material. No matter how advanced, Dr. Vasquez watched the readings as the first shot fired, creating a gravitational distortion that bent space itself around one of the smaller alien ships. The ship crumpled slightly, its crystal structure showing actual cracks for the first time. But within seconds, the aliens had deployed some kind of gravitational stabilizer, and the ship's hull began repairing itself. "They're adapting to everything we throw at them," Dr. Vasquez reported with growing desperation. "Every weapon works for a few minutes, then becomes useless." Above the cities of Earth, Commander Zareth's voice filled everyone's mind, and this time there was genuine amusement in the tone. "How predictable," the alien commander said. "Quantum manipulation, temporal displacement, gravitational distortion. Your species has followed exactly the same technological development path as 847 other civilizations we have encountered. You have learned to manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe, but you still think like primitives. You believe that more exotic energy equals more effective weapons." The alien ships began their counterattack using the same weapons they had demonstrated at Fort Morrison. Phase displacement beams made humanity's weapons simply fade out of existence. Gravitational compressors turned tanks and aircraft into compact cubes of twisted metal. Time freeze fields left entire military units standing like statues. "Your quantum weapons show promise," Zareth continued, as if giving a lecture to students. "In perhaps 1,000 years, your species might develop them into truly effective tools. Your temporal manipulation is quite clever, though terribly inefficient. And your gravitational devices demonstrate a basic understanding of space-time mechanics. We are impressed by your rapid progress." Dr. Vasquez felt tears of frustration running down her face as she watched her life's work being systematically neutralized. Humanity's greatest scientific achievements were being dismissed like a child's science fair project. "Unfortunately," Zareth's voice continued, "impressive is not the same as effective. Your weapons are exactly what we expected from the species. At your level of development, predictable, conventional, ultimately futile." Around the world, humanity's most advanced weapons fell silent as the aliens' adaptive shields made them completely useless. The exotic energy signatures that had taken months to develop were now as harmless as flashlight beams against the crystal ships. It seemed like humanity's last hope had failed, but in hidden positions around the globe, Tom Chun and his volunteers were still waiting. They had watched the exotic weapons fail, just as Tom had predicted they would. Now, it was time to try something that the aliens would never expect, something so old, so simple, so primitive, that the most advanced civilization in the galaxy might not even recognize it as a weapon. Tom picked up a longbow that had been crafted using techniques unchanged for over 1,000 years. He knocked an arrow made of wood and steel, materials that humans had been using for warfare since before they had learned to write. "This is crazy," whispered William, holding a crossbow beside him. "Crazy enough that it might work," Tom replied. Drawing back the bowstring, the moment that would change everything was about to begin.